Welcome to the Supply Geek podcast, the show that turns shipping containers and glossy corporate advertising into real stories worth sharing. I'm your host, Ben Thornton-Jones, and whether you're a supply chain geek like me, a conscious consumer, or just someone who's always wondered how the cocoa ends up in your favorite bar of chocolate, you are in the right place. Each episode, we unpack the hidden stories behind the stuff we use and the things we do every day. From palm oil plantations to the milk supply chain, from cargo ships to carbon emissions. We're not just about moving goods, we're here to move minds. So, grab your map of the world, adjust your safety vest of skepticism, and let's dive into the weird and wonderful world of supply chains. Let's get geeky. So my guest today and top cocoa geek is Antonie Fountain. Antonie, welcome to the podcast. As well as a supply geek, I'm an absolute chocoholic, and I've also worked previously with Nestle many years ago. So I've been connected to chocolate products and the supply chain there, but never actually been involved in the sourcing of cocoa. So I'm really excited to find out a lot more today. But before we get into that, as we always do, we want to find out a bit about you first. So please tell us a little bit about you, your career, how you got to this point, and why do you know more than most people about cocoa?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, the last one is quite simple to answer. I've been spending the better part of the last 2 decades working on cocoa. And so, as with most things, how do you get good at something is by repeated, determined repetition, so to speak. So, about 20 years ago, I got into the cocoa sector. At that time, I was working in marketing. I was also trying to become a rock star, which, there's a lot of failed, wannabe pop musicians out there, and I'm one of those many. But I bumped into the issues of child slavery and forced child labor in the cocoa sector. And sometimes you hear about these things and you're like, oh, that's horrible. Somebody should do something about it. But for me, it landed like one level deeper, and I felt like personally offended by this. And until the day of today, I do not know why, but I felt I have to get involved in this. This is something I need to be involved in. So call it what you will, but something bit me that day. And a couple of weeks later, gave up my job to help set up this tiny little anti-trafficking campaigning NGO in the Netherlands, and then quite quickly realized that tiny NGOs might not actually make a big difference on their own. And so working together is better. And so kind of within several months started looking for ways how to collectively organize countervailing power. And I've been doing that ever since. So that's how I rolled into this. But I'm old enough now to not just do work. So I also love like having a life outside of work. So things like cycling, good coffee, woodworking are all these very typical. I'm a white male in his 40s with an office job. So if you want to look at the tick box of what are all the cliches, I'll have most of them, I think.
Fantastic. Well, I'm also in that club, a white male in his 40s. So I never thought it would happen, but gardening has come onto the list, and growing vegetables and lots of other things as well. So but hey, I'm starting a podcast. Is that a 40s thing? I don't know. Maybe
pretty sure that's on the list as well, Ben. Yep.
Oh no, I'm such a stereotype. Oh my goodness. But there we go. Well, fantastic. Well, I mean, you are absolutely the right person to talk about cocoa, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation because I think it's so important. I mean, the ethos of this podcast and why I started it is, I worked in supply chain for the last 20 years. I've had the pleasure of being able to get deeper into different supply chains of different materials based on the companies that I was working for. And you realize that, when I speak to my friends and family, people don't know about the supply chains behind it. They don't understand where things come from, which is completely understandable. They're at the consumer end of those supply chains where very little is shared. So I think, the ethos of this to really uncover the supply chains behind those everyday goods, I can't think of a better material to talk about than cocoa or chocolate that is more widely loved globally. To me and to many others, it is the ultimate indulgent treat. I had a quick check. The average global consumption of chocolate, approximately 1 kilo per person per year. However, that's often on the global population. That's very skewed based on the market, because as we know, different markets love chocolate even more. That can go up to 9 or 10 kilos if we're talking the US, Switzerland, places like this. So, this is a really loved material. But
And the
most people,
skewing is highly colonial as well, right? I think it's really important to show that, like, chocolate is consumed almost exclusively in countries that were former colonizers. The colonized very seldom eat chocolate. And so there's like that global average. You can cut that in, you can double that for
Mm.
countries that used to have colonies, and you can kind of stripe it away if you used to be a colony, unless the colonizers managed to settle you permanently, like Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, which is where I'm originally from, etc. So, yeah.
Yeah, very true. And I think, we'll get onto this when we get into the sort of the volumes in the supply chain, where it's coming from, who's consuming it. You've got a great chart that we'll be able to flash up for the YouTube version
Hmm.
from your cocoa barometer, where that really stark view of seeing that, production is in the global south and all the consumption moves generally to the global north. So
Yep.
I think that'll be really interesting for people to see. Um, but fantastic. I mean, let's get into it a little bit. I mean, we'll touch on, of course, the cocoa barometer, because I think it's a fantastic documentation that you do, and most recently you put out the one from 2025. Just one thing that I'll start on, a line that really struck me from there was the line talking about that cocoa is in a bad place, but it's better than it was, but it
Hmm.
can be a lot better. That
Yeah.
really hit home with me, and I think we'll want to get through all of those and really uncover the bits behind that. But let's start from the very start. It would be great to hear for people and to understand just what is cocoa, maybe some historical information behind it and how it came to be such a loved product, and then perhaps we can get into primarily where does it come from.
Yeah, so like cocoa is like a really old product, right? Like 5,500 years ago, cultures in the Andes were already kind of grinding the beans of the cocoa tree and consuming it. We're not quite sure how they were consuming it. We're not sure if it was fermented, if it was an alcoholic beverage, if it was done differently than that. But it's been consumed for 5,500 years. And when we consume cocoa, cocoa is actually on the inside, it's not dark. It's actually very, very white. It's like this white, lychee like uh, um, the seeds inside a very soft, pulpy, big pod about the size and shape of an American football, and that needs to be dried and fermented. Sorry, other way around, fermented and then dried before it actually turns into this dark brown thing. At which point it then gets kind of ground and roasted, etc., and then pressed. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens before it turns into something that we could consider to reasonably be anything close to chocolate. And even then, our palates are so used to chocolate being sweet, you're going to have to put a lot of sugar into it, because cocoa of itself is absolutely not sweet. Like, that bitter taste is the chocolate, and the creamy stuff is the chocolate, but the sweet is the sugar. Right? But even though, like, it comes from Latin America, which means that Europe and like the colonizing world did not actually get in touch with it until about 500-600 years ago. Um, and then it quite quickly became very fashionable in Europe as a drink. So what you would do is you'd grab like this processed cocoa bean stuff, and you'd add milk or water to it. Actually, water was not too great to consume back in the 1700s. So what people would often do is they would add cocoa to either beer or wine, because that was like the healthier thing to drink. And that look on your face, Ben, is also the look that I would have, because, I just don't see how that goes well together.
Oh,
But that's how they did it for the longest time, until basically, so like chocolate, the way we know it, is relatively new. Like, the process to actually put a bunch of different chemicals in the cocoa so that when you're mixing it, you can actually then turn it into chocolate, and was invented by a Dutch guy called Nicolaas van Houten, which is why that process is still called Dutching. When you Dutch the cocoa, you actually start
Ah.
making it ready for chocolate. So chocolate itself is not even 200 years old, and really exploded onto the market once it did become what it was, which is why like 100 years ago during the Second World War, everybody was asking for chocolate in the Netherlands when the Americans and Canadians and Brits finally came to liberate us, and we were asking for that because we hadn't had chocolate in this country for 5 years because of the Germans. So, like within 100 years, it became so established. But chocolate is relatively new.
Yeah, really fascinating. And I think it's so true, isn't it? The sort of, most people will think of chocolate as a very sweet
Hmm.
product, but actually the
Yeah,
sweetness is the sugar,
yeah,
right?
exactly.
Anyone that's maybe it's come slightly more fashionable in the last sort of 10, 15 years that, it's almost a bit of a test. You get a 70% bar and then you get an 80%. And the more and more you try, and I've, well, had the slight displeasure of trying 100% because you get some of those bars. And I mean, there's a bit of chocolate there, but just the cocoa content is so high and it's very bitter, and
Hmm.
hence why you can add it to savory dishes and other things. And I think, you can even drink it as almost more of a coffee espresso. It could be sort of drunk in that way as well. But as you say, once mixed with sugar, milk,
Hmm.
other things, it becomes this incredibly indulgent product that is loved by so many
Absolutely.
people.
But the funny thing is that if you get a milk chocolate bar, the number one ingredient is neither milk nor cocoa, it's sugar.
Mm.
And that's what a lot of people also don't realize. Having been in the cocoa sector for a long time, I've become a bit of a snob. So I like my chocolate to be of quality and of a high cocoa content. But
Hmm.
basically, the percentage in and of itself doesn't say that much initially, because it's really got to do with how well is it made. In the same way
Mm.
as if you go into alcohol, you don't say, "Oh, I only drink beverages above a certain percentage." You're like,
Mm.
you're either a bourbon or an Irish whiskey, or you're a
Hmm.
cognac, or things like that, right? It's got to do with what's the flavor profile, what's the process, how it's being made, etc. So when you start unpacking that, the rabbit hole goes very deep indeed. And so you can get like an 80 or a 90 or even 100% bar that is very refined in its flavors because of the way that the beans have been processed post harvest, because of the way that the chocolate has been made. It actually also makes a lot of difference how long you grind the beans for. Like if you grind the beans for just a couple of hours, you're going to get a lower grade chocolate than if you grind it for 3 full days straight, right? So there's
Mm.
all these different things. And then like there's this Ecuadorian chocolate company that sells their top end bars for $500 per bar. And they actually store their chocolate in whiskey barrels for several weeks or if not months. And chocolate actually has the quality that it kind of takes in flavor profiles from things around it, which is why you should never store your chocolate with onions.
Mm.
um,
Yeah.
but if you store your chocolate in like whiskey barrels, it actually can start grabbing some of the complexities there, etc. So there's a lot of stuff you can do with chocolate beyond just chucking some milk and sugar into it. But 3 to 5% of the world's population will have had that or will care about that. Most people actually don't like the good stuff. If they're given the good stuff, they won't touch it because it's not what I'm used to. Because what you're describing as that indulgence is actually the thing that we've kind of got imprinted into our brains in like this Pavlovian manner from very, very young, that chocolate is creamy and sweet. Um, and so like when you get into the good stuff, it's like you're discovering a completely new product, which
Yeah.
has a very different way of tasting it. It's like as if you're switching from lemonade to fine craft beers or something like
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really interesting because, in this series, we've gone through lots of different materials and we'll do lots more. And I think this starts to touch on the supply chain because as
that.
you
Hmm.
talk there, just as a percentage of people consuming maybe that premium end and some of the high end chocolates, the reality and probably most of what we're going to talk about in terms of the global supply chain is the bulk, pushing low price. It's very much it's
Yep.
chocolate, but then it's being mixed at a lower grade with sugars and other things. But yeah, interesting to know that broad range and just what you can do with chocolate in terms of consumer products. Great that you went through there just what cocoa is. I think we can, definitely again flash up some images for people of the cocoa pod, this sort of American football shaped
Hmm.
pod with, yes, as you say, I remember seeing for the first time one opened up, not in the flesh, but in pictures, and white beans. And I was thinking, surely this is wrong. But as you described there, it starts as white,
Yep.
needs to go through a whole different process before it becomes the chocolate that we know. But perhaps next, let's talk about where does it come from? Where are the major producing countries, areas? And then I'd really love to also start to talk about the people, the farmers behind this as well.
Absolutely. So, whereas cocoa originally comes from the Amazon region and then was first really domesticated in Mexico, about 150, 180 years ago, during the colonization period, it got transferred to West Africa, and that's where it really exploded in production. So, the two biggest producers in the world at the moment are Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. And Cote d'Ivoire is actually significantly bigger than Ghana, and Ghana is going through quite a slump, so they're getting smaller. So there's also several other major producer countries that are starting to catch up with Ghana, including Cameroon and Nigeria, and particularly Ecuador. So, kind of
Hmm.
Latin American cocoa is making a comeback at the moment.
Ah.
And Cocoa only grows in a very specific, very narrow belt around the equator. Cocoa is very specific about the kind of conditions that it needs to operate in. Can't be too dry, can't be too hot, can't be too high in elevation, definitely can't be too cold. All these things. It's quite picky. You need the Goldilocks place, right? So, and um, and so it grows in areas that are rainforests or were rainforests because that's where it originally comes from the rainforest. Like original cocoa trees will grow amongst a lot of other big old rainforest trees in the Amazon. And so, strangely enough, it loves growing in places that had or have rainforests in West Africa, in Southeast Asia as well, even though that's a much smaller production market at the moment. So, um, but that also means that cocoa is a real issue around deforestation because if it grows
Yeah.
well in places that are rainforests, then very quickly cocoa grows well in places that used to be rainforests, right? And so that's also what we see in Cote d'Ivoire and in Ghana, where like more than 90% of the original old growth forests has disappeared by now, largely due to
Wow.
agriculture, and the vast
Mm.
majority of that is cocoa. So there's a real issue there around the environmental side. And then you mentioned we need to talk about the people. Cocoa is grown predominantly by what we technically call smallholders. So those are
Hmm.
not large scale cocoa plantations, but smaller farms, and farms of somewhere between 1 and 5, 6 hectares. So not big at all. Now, there are some large scale plantations, especially in Latin America, but the vast majority is grown by small farmers who grow that with their household. And that means that there's a really high chance of household labor being involved that is not always appropriate. So we see a
Mm.
real issue of child labor there as well. And we see a real issue of gender inequality. So there's a lot of women cocoa farmers,
Hmm.
but they often are quite disadvantaged in this as well. So there's as I like to say it, cocoa has a problem tree, and that problem tree has two very big branches. And the one branch is on the human rights side, where child labor, which is how I got into cocoa almost 2 decades ago, but also gender inequality and worker rights and other issues are a real issue. The other big branch is really on the environmental side, where we see deforestation as a major driver. Um, and that is also exacerbating climate change, which is really affecting cocoa production. And as I said before, it's a Goldilocks crop. It needs the right conditions, and climate shocks are pretty terrible. And we're going to get to the effects of climate shocks later in this
Yeah.
conversation. I am 100% sure. Um, And so deforestation and climate change, which really vastly kind of reinforce each other, are part of it. But also, for example, the use of agrochemicals and the improper use of agrochemicals is a
Mm.
real issue. And we're seeing a lot of gold mining affecting the cocoa sector as well. And that's most predominantly seen and visible in Ghana and a little bit in Cote d'Ivoire, but it is also really affecting what's happening in Latin America as well. So when there's gold in the ground, people want to take it out, and they don't
Mm.
care if there's cocoa trees on top of it. So so
Wow.
there's this problem tree, these two huge branches of environmental and human rights challenges. They don't just hang there in thin air. They stand on a tree trunk, and that tree trunk is the poverty of farmers. And so
Mm.
almost every single cocoa farmer is a poor person, right? In the same way that almost every coffee farmer and almost every cotton farmer and almost every soy or palm oil or rubber farmer are. We've designed our global international commodity system to drive poverty. It's not
Mm.
broken. It's working very well. It's working the
Yeah.
way it should.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll get to that later, but it basically means that cocoa and other tropical commodity farmers are by default very poor. And that poverty exacerbates all of the human rights and environmental challenges. Now, I'm not saying if you solve poverty, you solve child labor and deforestation, but I am saying the other way around. If you don't solve poverty, you're going to have a really, really hard time solving the issues of child labor, solving the issues of gender inequality,
Mhm. Mhm.
of deforestation and climate change, etc. So as a matter of efficiency, not just as a matter of human rights, but as a matter of efficiency, poverty alleviation should be a key part of that. Now,
Mm.
there's also roots to this problem tree, right? Because it's not just because companies are doing things wrong. There's also a real problem in the government system as well, where it comes to like the rural development strategies, the infrastructure, the rule of law, transparency and
Mhm.
accountability and corruption. Are the
Yeah.
markets functioning in farmers' interests, or are they functioning in the interest of the person that can cream a little bit off the market, et cetera, et cetera? But also things like, have we made all of this sustainability thing a voluntary space, or shouldn't we just create a mandatory level playing field for all companies so that it's a lot less easy to exploit people and planet, right? So
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
is the way we look at where cocoa comes from, is largely in West Africa, but the problem tree is quite, that model works across the entire globe where cocoa is grown. We've got these branches of human rights and environmental problems standing on a tree trunk of farmer poverty,
Mm.
rooted in real governance issues.
Yeah, it's so fascinating, and I think we will flash up as you described this, um, cocoa tree of the challenges and those
Mhm.
branches, because there's so many topics on there, and like every supply chain that we talk about, when we talk about challenges, talk about issues, it's highly complex. There are nuances. There are very many of them that are intertwined, interlinked, and cocoa, I think, is very much the same. But as you talked about there, what's really interesting is there is significant demand for cocoa. So you have the demand signals there,
Mhm.
which then drive, I guess, these regions of the world, as you talked about Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. There is demand there for cocoa. Therefore, people in these areas where cocoa can grow, as you said, in rainforested areas, well, cocoa tree next to it, a non-cocoa tree, well, that's taking up space where I could have another cocoa tree. So that's where you get the deforestation issues as well. So, yeah, super, super interesting. Maybe we can start to touch a little bit on, we talked there about that it's smallholder farmers with, relatively small plot of land in these areas. The cocoa is produced by them. I guess, would you say at that level, is the farmer, or at what stage is the farmer getting the cocoa to? Is he or she getting it to a point where it is finished brown cocoa beans in bags, ready to move to the next stage in the supply chain?
In most parts of the world, yes. What you'll see is the general space of smallholder cocoa farmers, at least in West and Central Africa, is they will grow the cocoa. They will break open the pods themselves. They'll take the beans out. The beans then tend to be placed in fermentation systems. And in West Africa, that fermentation system is actually kind of a shallow hole with banana leaves on it. And you put the things on there, put leaves on top, and then it's at a slight angle. And so kind of the juice drips out whilst it's fermenting for a couple of days, etc. That juice is often then sold as local liquor, etc. You can also get it unfermented, and then it's actually really nice juice. It's like a lychee juice almost. It's really,
Ah,
really
nice.
there's actually some companies in the Netherlands that are now starting to sell that as juice in stores because it's nice.
Oh, wow.
Which, yeah, and when you take a sip of that, you're like, can't believe this is chocolate, and it's like it really, really does
Yeah.
not taste anything like cocoa at all. Um, so, and then after it's been fermented for several days, it will then be brought to either the farm or kind of the community. It's then laid out on a drying platform. First village I ever visited, the farmer just chucked it on the concrete in front of his house. Chickens were walking through it, picking out the debris. Not necessarily the most hygienic way of doing it. You see different stages of professionalism there. Best case scenario, or kind of if a community is reasonably well organized, they'll have like platforms of about like 1 meter high, where the
Hmm.
really long platforms where it's laid out to dry, and then it gets turned around on a very regular basis so that it kind of dries up evenly, by which time it starts getting this recognizable brownish color that we call chocolate. Right.
Hmm.
But that's in West Africa. In other places, actually, cocoa is the post-harvest processing, as they call it, done a lot more centralized. So um, I was in Ecuador 2, 3 years ago at this cooperative that actually brought in the wet beans directly. So basically, the pods got broken open, chucked in a bucket, and then sent to the local cooperative where the fermentation was done in big tanks centrally, etc.
Mm.
And then the drying was also done in much more professional drying stations. You also see this happen in Southeast Asia, and so certain traders are starting to put this model into Central Africa as well. So there's different ways of doing it. So like at a small scale or at a more kind of unified scale. Those are two different ways of doing that. Probably if you do it centralized and if there's people that know what they're doing, I would say that generally speaking, you get better quality.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, really interesting to understand the different ways of doing that. It'd be great now to talk about, let's get into that supply chain, so where it reaches that stage, because that's a long way, and I think many hands that we'll talk about away
Hmm.
from a final consumer product,
Yep.
consumer company.
Absolutely.
Not affiliated with any companies on this podcast series, but I think, for example, Tony's has done a pretty good job on their bar of being able to show people the many different uneven segments and
Hmm.
cuts that are taken in
Yep.
the cocoa supply chain. So it'd be great if you could touch on there and just talk us through. You said these are very poor smallholders,
Yep.
and it's about a push in a way to keep at that poverty level. Uh, Talk, if you can, a little bit about what are the different hands that it goes through before it eventually reaches the sort of consumer stage, and how many people are taking cuts and bites from that supply chain.
Yeah, that's a great question. Fun fact around the Tony's bar: if they've like every piece is uneven, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you look carefully and closely at the bar, it is actually a simplified representation of the map of West Africa. And the bottom of the bar is
Oh,
the equator. And if you look at it, you can actually see Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana and Togo and Cameroon, etc. So
I didn't
it's a
realize
little
that.
fun fact.
Wow.
Um, the the way that cocoa happens is, so the farmer and his family tend to be the first people that touch it. Now, even here we can go into a lot of details, and because this is called the Supply Geek, let's get a little bit geeky. What we call farmers, we don't really know who the farmer is, right? So like, is it the person that owns the land? Is it the person that permanently works on the land? Or at the people that come in as seasonal laborers? Is this
Mm.
farmer a established person that's been doing this for decades? Or do we see like farming communities rotate and change in composition over time? I've been doing this for 2 decades. I'm supposed to know these things, and even I wouldn't be able to answer that question quite well at the moment, right? So this is something that we're really still trying to figure out is like, who is the farmer in the first place? Who's doing this work? Is
Hmm.
something that we really need to get a lot better grip on. There is historically been quite a lot of migration involved in this, and so, like, migrant labor of some kind is involved in a lot of spaces, but that migrant labor could already have been that the farmer actually is the grandson of the migrant who had come here 50, 60 years ago and has had
Hmm.
been running that farm for 2, 3 generations. But especially in West Africa, that is still considered a migrant, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
There's quite a really complex issue there. But once the farmer and their family, and sometimes there are also seasonal hired laborers or other people involved. And one of the things that got me involved is some of that seasonal hired labor could be child trafficking or could be kind of unpaid, minor, underage labor, etc. So
Hmm.
less of an issue now in Cote d'Ivoire than it was 20 years ago by the looks of it. But we're getting reports, for example, from its neighboring country, Liberia, where cocoa is now in a boom, where these things are happening all over the place again, right? So it's like history repeating. Um, so there are laborers and people involved, and I think that the women in the farms really deserve some special recognition there. There's quite a few farms that are headed by females. There are quite a
Hmm.
few farms where women do a lot of the work, and when they don't do a lot of the work on the farm, they're doing a lot of the work in the household, right? So there's always like we always
Yeah.
underestimate how incredibly much we have to thank the women for, right? And I think
Mm.
that's a real, and you might find that's one of the threads through this conversation that I'll continuously be bringing in the issue of, okay, so what about the women? Because we tend to
Mhm.
view this from a very male dominated gaze, right? So
Mhm.
women play a really key role there. Once the cocoa has been harvested, and this harvesting actually sometimes also happens through increasingly through like harvesting gangs and communities coming together to do the work together, or the pruning gets done collectively, etc., because it's just more efficient to do it collectively. At that point, once it's fermented, it gets brought together and centrally dried often, usually within the communities. And this is where it starts splitting up. If you're working organizedly as farmers together,
Mhm.
you'll do your storage and your drying together. You'll probably even do your selling and your bringing further downstream collectively, either through a cooperative or through a community, etc. But there's also a lot of farms, especially in areas that are harder to reach. And when I say harder to reach, it can take 8 hours on a really bumpy road going like 6, 7 kilometers an hour. Dunk, 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 dunk. It's like
Wow.
hard to reach is not
Mm.
like uh, an overstatement here.
Yeah.
Um, and so, like, I've been to the field where we were on our way to a village, and there was such a deep puddle that we just couldn't get through it. And the only things that could get through it was maybe like a big truck because they've got much more clearance. And we had
Yeah.
to cancel the trip to the village because we couldn't reach it. Like, that's what I mean with hard to reach, right? Um, so the harder to reach ones, they might not be in cooperatives, they might not be in community organizers, and so often there's like these individual small like traders that come by on their motorbike and will put like half a bag on the back of their motorbike and go to the next place. Um, and there's a real problematic issue there because it actually starts creating a lack of transparency. It's a lot easier to be transparent when you're working as a
Mhm.
collective than when you've
Mm.
got all these tiny little untraceable little traders that are working there. At some point, either through the cooperative or through these little traders, pisteurs and traitants, they're called in Cote d'Ivoire, at some point, they will move the beans to the big ports or processing areas in Cote d'Ivoire and in Ghana and in other places. Um, and again, hard to reach. So there's like high transport costs there. And if you're in places that are unstable, like Ecuador, there's also high risk of being kidnapped or kind of having to pay bribes or kind of being robbed, etc.
Okay. Mm.
And at the moment, cocoa prices are really high. So kind of the value of the content of a truck has like quadrupled over the last 2 years. And so it's like, it's worth hijacking a cocoa,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Um, so there's real issues there in transportation from the farms to the ports. Um, And this could be done centralized, this could be done like at an individual level. Once they get to the ports, actually, either the beans are then kind of shipped into boats and sent to Europe or Indonesia or the US or Mexico for processing, or what you see quite a bit as well, especially in West Africa and in Indonesia, the cocoa beans get processed in country. So,
Mhm.
like Cote d'Ivoire and the Netherlands are the two world's biggest cocoa processor countries, and they're always on a head-to-head, like who wins there. But so quite a lot of beans are actually processed in Ghana and in Cote d'Ivoire. So they think they can go to the factories where it
Mm.
gets turned into a next phase of the product, which the beans then get turned into either cocoa mass or cocoa liquor, what it's called. So it gets like churned for a very long time, and the longer it gets churned, the higher the quality.
Mhm.
So that's cocoa liquor, cocoa mass, and then that gets put into big machinal presses. And then you get two different products. You get the cocoa butter, which is like an odorless, tasteless, very rich, creamy, buttery like substance. And that's actually what, when you eat chocolate, what gives you this feeling that it's melting in your mouth, because that's one of the greatest things of chocolate is it melts at the exact temperature of the inside of your mouth. That's the thing that we love about it. That kind of just melts away
Mm.
inside,
Yes.
right? Um,
Mm.
and that's because of this high fatty butter process. So they press it out. But the other thing that if you press this mass, you'll get butter on the one side and you'll get powder on the other side, which is actually just a really big, thick cake that you then grind to get the powder from, right?
Mm.
Um, and then to make chocolate, you'll grab some of the mass, the liquor, so this highly concentrated chocolate stuff. Um, and for quality chocolate, you'll put a little bit of sugar in that, and that's basically all. Right? But for most of the chocolate that you or I or most normal consumers will eat, they'll grab some of the mass, they'll grab some butter, and then they'll add sugar and milk, and they'll mix those four ingredients until you get your sweeter cream. So it's creamier, it's less
Mhm.
intense because it's got this butter, which is tasteless and odorless, and it's got the milk and the sugar in, right? So that's already where things change a lot. Um, and white chocolate, in fact, is just the butter and the sugar and the powder. Sorry, the butter, the sugar, and the milk. And that's why white
Yeah.
chocolate does not taste like chocolate,
No.
because the chocolate component is the tasteless, odorless part of the stuff, right? So
Yeah.
when people say they prefer white chocolate, what they prefer is the taste of sweet milk powder, right?
Exactly.
Um,
Exactly.
and so, and once I started understanding this, I realized why I never liked white chocolate in the first place.
Mm.
This is
Mm.
also why snobs in the chocolate sector will say that white chocolate is not chocolate,
Mhm.
because you've actually taken away the thing that tastes like chocolate,
You
right?
have?
It still
Mm.
has cocoa components to it because it's got cocoa powder,
Mm.
cocoa butter in it, but it's not chocolate, right?
Yeah.
And so, but so the final stages of chocolate making usually is not done in origin. There are caveats there, but like, because it will melt at the inside temperature of your mouth is the outside temperature of the air in the tropics, right? So
Mhm.
you'll need a lot of refrigeration to do that. You'll also need milk and sugar to make the final chocolate. So a lot of this processing in origin is often turning it into butter, powder, or liquor, right? And then it gets shipped, often to Europe. Very often to Europe, sometimes to Indonesia. Mexico is also a big processor country, etc. Mexico does that for the US. It'll be really interesting to see what these tariff wars will mean in the medium to long term around
Yeah.
how these things are distributed globally, etc.
Mhm.
Um, and then they kind of here in Europe. So, like the world's biggest cocoa port, the world's number one cocoa port is Amsterdam, believe it or not.
Oh, okay.
And there's a huge historical cocoa processing industry near Amsterdam because, as you remember from the earlier in this conversation, this process called Dutching was invented by the Dutch, and so they've got this
Mm.
historical narrative of drive of like processing chocolate, etc. So people are always talking about Belgian and Swiss chocolate, and
Mhm.
yes, there is that too. But actually, most of the Belgian and the Swiss chocolate comes through Amsterdam, and a lot of that is initially the first steps are done in the Netherlands through processes that were invented in the Netherlands as well. Now, I'm half Dutch, so forgive a little bit of patriotism here, but yeah. The, and then it goes to the final stages where it gets turned into something that looks like chocolate. So kind of
Mm-hmm.
the liquor and the butter get mixed with milk and sugar. They get heated up so that it kind of mixes nicely like a chocolate fountain, which also you need it
Mm-hmm.
to be fluid so that you can mix it through each other.
Mm-hmm.
And then it gets processed into the shapes and the forms and put around the candy bars, or put into the shapes for the chocolate bars that we know, etc., and used. So that's kind of how the supply chain works, and then it goes to the stores.
Yeah. Wow. So fascinating. And I think for people, just as you've just explained over the last few minutes, that journey from the smallholder farmer through so many different hands, such a lack of transparency. I mean, what really hit me was you talking about that very first stage where maybe you have, I don't know, an aggregator on a motorbike picking up the odd bag. I mean, instantly there, you've lost any transparency and traceability as to
Yep,
where the cocoa has come from,
that
literally at the
becomes really
first
hard.
stage there.
Yeah.
And also, I think another thing that struck me as well was, this is, as we talked about at the start, this podcast is trying to uncover those hidden supply chains. Well, you just talked about the fact that also the location of the start of these supply chains is incredibly hidden, hours upon hours, beyond sort of, dirt tracks and things like this. It's also so hidden in that form as well from people to understand, and the many hands that it goes through. But really, really fascinating.
There's a lot of work being done on this, though, and one of the reasons for that is that the European Union is bringing in a new regulation on deforestation.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the first steps in combating deforestation is you're going to have to know where your cocoa is coming from to know whether or not it's being deforested. So on the 30th of December of this year, the EUDR is supposed to go into force. We might get into that later, but the EU is really, really screwing up the rollout of this regulation, and like not in a minor way, but in like Brexit levels of incompetence and catastrophe kind of a way. Um, but this EUDR is requiring cocoa to be traceable to farm level. And so that's really been driving a huge change in the cocoa sector over the past couple of years, where companies, simply because it needs to be legally compliant, need to know where it's coming from. Now, at the moment, or about a year and a half ago, probably half the cocoa supply chain was what we call indirect, and half of it was direct. And the direct supply chain means you know where it's coming from, the other half you don't. And that is actually quite a high percentage of direct supply chain compared to a lot of other tropical commodities, right? So like the traceability in cocoa is higher than in many others. Our hypothesis is that with this new EU deforestation regulation, or EUDR, you're not going to be allowed to have an indirect supply chain anymore. You simply are going to have to know where it comes from. And so anybody that wants to be able to sell to Europe will have to be completely traceable. And since Europe is way more than half of the world's consumption and production of chocolate, they've such a sway on the sector that the whole sector is working to get there. And when I say the whole sector, I mean almost the whole sector. There are a couple of companies that are still quite comfortable with being untraceable, but they're going to bump into some real huge issues around compliancy within quite foreseeable future, if all is well.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating topic, and one that we've touched on. We have done a palm oil episode in this series already, and I think that was a real light bulb moment for me, because as you well explained there, but just to elaborate for people, the European Union's deforestation regulation is essentially saying we as European Union and our consumers, we don't want to be contributing, let's say, to deforestation. Therefore, any products coming into our European Union, we want to check that they can be verified that they did not come from deforested locations. They pick out certain supply chains that are very synonymous with the challenges around causing deforestation. So, of course, cocoa is one, palm oil is another, but you have various others: rubber, soy, coffee, etc. But I do find that really fascinating. We talked about palm
How
oil,
long
and we
ago did you do that?
literally a month ago.
Okay.
I,
The world has changed significantly since then, which is why I'm asking. So, with the last month has just seen utter chaos in Brussels around the EUDR and its rollout. And um, with that chaos, it's going to become harder and harder for anybody to comply to any regulation that will
mm,
be discussed in the next couple of weeks, at least by the end of this year. So my expectation is that it will be delayed again because they
mhm.
delayed it a year ago for 12 months. Um, but so there will be an EUDR. It will come into force at some point, but what it will look like and for who it will be appropriate and applicable is at the moment really anyone's guess.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Yeah, and interestingly, when we touched on the EUDR in our palm oil conversation, because literally about an hour before I was speaking to Judith, who I spoke to about palm oil, there had been the news coming out about the second delay to the EU deforestation regulations. So we touched on that. But no, what I was going to say is that from a palm oil perspective in Europe, I can't remember the numbers, but it's only like maybe 5-10%
yeah.
of the world's palm oil is going into Europe. So, very much less so than places like China and India that are huge importers. But cocoa, as you say, Europe is a huge importer of it. Therefore, from that particular commodity and trying to tackle deforestation, it could be something
Mhm.
really significant and powerful, but it just needs to come into force, which I know from working in this as well in the company that I previously worked in, and we were getting ready for it. It's very challenging to continue to have these delays when, as you say, most companies have put a lot of money and effort into preparing and getting ready for this. It doesn't look good on the European Union that they have further delayed this, and it really needs to come into force in some shape or form.
Absolutely. It looks pretty terrible, to be honest. So,
Yeah, not good at all. Not good at all. Really fascinating to understand. Let's get back to talking about that supply chain. It'd be great to talk now about, you talk through the different layers of the supply chain, obviously those many hands that it goes through. Really, I would say taking a cut of the value that's coming from cocoa. It'd be great to talk now about cocoa pricing because
yep.
it's very pertinent at the moment. You touched on
Hmm.
the incredibly high price at the moment. We
Yep.
will flash up an incredibly interesting chart from the cocoa barometer, which
Hmm.
just shows this huge spike that we've got at the moment in terms of the cocoa price compared to how it was historically. But yeah, maybe you can talk for a second about the current challenges with the cocoa price. What has driven that cocoa price? And maybe you could also, that is the global cocoa price of what people are buying. But at the same time, how is that also impacting the cocoa farmer, who is just one
Yep.
stakeholder in this supply chain?
So over the last decades, like since the early 80s, the cocoa price has been trending downwards towards around $2,500 a ton, adjusted for inflation today, right? Um, and then about a year and a half, 2 years ago, the price started going up. And it started going up faster and even faster. And then last year, so in 2024, twice the cocoa price hit about $13,000 a ton, which is like kind of over the last 30 years on average $2,500 a ton. So this is like 5 times
My
the
goodness.
sector average, etc. Um, and there were a range of reasons why this happened. There's not just one thing that you can point out and say it was this, because if it's just the one thing, the minute that stops, everything goes back to normal again. But the main reason why the price went up was because the two biggest cocoa producer countries, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, had disastrous harvests 2 years in a row.
Mhm.
And why did they have disastrous harvests? Well, part of that was this recurring weather event called El Nino, which anybody that works in commodities knows affects kind of these cycles that are there,
Mhm.
etc. And we've had El Ninos on regular basis over, well, ever since, hundreds of years. And so kind of that it's coming at some point and that it's going to hit. But this time there was a lot more going on than just an El Nino. part of that has got to do with the fact that because we've seen such widespread deforestation in specifically West Africa because of cocoa, these kind of weather events coupled with climate change are becoming way more extreme. And so kind of they hit so much harder. And
Mhm.
so in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, they were hit much worse than the rest because of the fact that they didn't have the rainforests help as kind of buffer zones. They help as rain machines. They're like this big thick layer of rubber around a bumper car. And yeah, you'll hit, but the hit will be less impactful than if you didn't. And like in Cote d'Ivoire and in Ghana, we've just removed the rubber band around the bumper car and still are bumping into things. And so
Mm.
those bumps, those shocks are just, they hit way harder, right? Um, but it wasn't just that. The war in Ukraine played a role, as did the COVID crisis, because we've had this massive supply chain disruption of
Mm.
particularly agricultural inputs. Ukraine is the world's number one supplier of agrochemicals, right? And so when you don't have
Mhm.
agrochemicals, that also becomes harder to hit you become harder hit in a year of climate shocks, right? Because you don't have the fertilizer to help kind of compensate for the bad weather conditions. You don't have the pesticides that you need for when it becomes hotter and wetter. Those are perfect thriving conditions for pests and diseases. And so if you don't
Mm.
have the agrochemicals to help against the pests and diseases, the pests and diseases will hurt more. Additionally, in West Africa at the moment, we have a tree pandemic called cocoa swollen shoot virus, which is hurting cocoa trees in Cote d'Ivoire and in Ghana, and has been for a while, but it only gets worse if you don't have the things to act, if you don't have the right inputs to fight them with. There's another disease called black pod that plays a really significant role. And in the past years, gold mining in Cote d'Ivoire, but particularly Ghana, has also created massive destruction against all of this. Now, underlying all of this is the fact that farmers are so poor that they have lost resilience. And so if you are so poor, it's very hard to withstand the shocks. And this wasn't one shock. This was 5, 6, 7 shocks happening all at the same time. And so we saw production in Ghana and in Cote d'Ivoire go down by 20 to 30%. Now, if you bear in mind that Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire do 60 to 70% of the world's cocoa production, that's a huge gap in
Mm.
what needs to happen. And so people started realizing, crap, we're running out of cocoa. And it was like a gold rush for cocoa beans. And so
Yeah.
things just went higher and higher and higher and higher and higher. But because it wasn't just an El Nino weather event, but because it was also the gold mining, it was also these crop diseases that are causing long-term damage to it, because it was a lack of resilience in farmers. It wasn't as if after like one unfavorable weather season, we're back to the old levels. No, it's like there's been permanent destruction of production capacity in these countries. And so people are realizing we're in this for the longer term. So the prices didn't just collapse the minute they went up. Now, I have to say the prices are going down at the moment, and they're going down quite quickly. So we're back down to 4,500, 5,000.
Okay.
We don't know how much further this collapse is going. About spring of last year, I started saying, if we don't do something about the kind of the increase that will happen after this decrease, then we're going to see prices collapse like crazy. I hate to be right, but I think that we will see that happen within at least the next year or two, that prices will go down to historically low levels um,
Yeah.
as well, because that's part of, if you let supply and demand completely determine how much you're paying your farmers, in a world that is becoming more and more volatile, prices will as well. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And this is what we see from, look, prices go up and down everywhere. This is the nature of business, right?
Yep.
But at the same time, these real extreme shocks are, really kick the system very, very badly and cause
Yep.
these sort of long-term challenges. We did an episode on vanilla. We talked a lot about that. Palm oil as well has really gone up and down, and we'll talk forever more about lots of other materials that we talk about on this on this program, even just the other day, talking about batteries and lithium and things like this. It's the nature of business, but at the same time, this is a real challenge.
Yep.
Question: the huge jump in price on cocoa going up to those record highs. Assume the farmers got loads of that benefit?
It depends where in the world you are a farmer. And that's because the markets are structured differently in different countries. So if you were an Ecuadorian or a Nigerian cocoa farmer, or a Brazilian cocoa farmer, you were having a good year, right? Because in those countries, farmers are paid spot prices. And so basically the price that you pay at farm gate follows the world market price within 2 or 3 weeks, right? If you were a farmer in Cote d'Ivoire and in Ghana, that is a very different story, because historically, for decades in Ghana and for the last 14, 15 years in Cote d'Ivoire, the government actually have in place a price stabilization system. And so the Ivorian and the Ghanaian government forward sell about 70 to 80% of every year's harvest. And then when they've done that, they can then go to the farmers and guarantee a fixed price for that harvest because they forward sold it, right? So in years when prices fluctuate a lot downwards or et cetera, you're actually creating a protection system for your farmers. And usually prices tend to swing downwards faster than upwards, right? So in general, it's not a bad thing. However, this once in a lifetime market situation that we've seen, is not great for such a forward selling system, because like the Ivorians and Ghanaians, they tend to forward sell with like an 18-month advance. And so they had sold the cocoa that was going at the world market for 13,000. They'd sold it for 2.5. Which is not great for the farmer, but I'll actually say this: it's also not great for the forward seller either. Right? So actually, and because their yields were so low, the Ivorian and Ghanaian government were in deep trouble because they weren't able to make good on their forward selling contracts. And like these guys are saying, yeah, we got a contract to buy this for $2,500. And they're like, sorry, we've run out of cocoa. And so not only were they getting a lower price, they couldn't even make good on the contracts that they had the lower price for. So it was quite a problem on a lot of levels. So cocoa farmers in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana did not get this very high price initially. Now, by now, we're more than 18 months into this. So are cocoa farmers in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire getting a higher price? Yes, they are. Are they getting 13,000? No, they're not. But 13,000 was also, if you understand how terminal markets work, 13,000 is like the spot market, like the way the terminal markets work. And let's get a little bit geeky here. If you expect to have a supply shortage, the spot price will be higher than the long-term price, right? So you can, on the market, you can buy your price determined on when are you getting the delivery. That is the delivery. Today is the delivery. In 6 months is the delivery. In 12 months. And depending on what the market forecasts are, you will either have a higher spot market price or you'll have a higher kind of futures price, right? And when there's a shortage now, spot prices go up, etc. So like, how do you count what the price was? That wasn't like the 18-month price. It was the spot price that was at 13,000. But most people buy their cocoa forward sales. And so like the Ivorian and Ghanaian cocoa boards forward sell not on the spot, they sell on the long term. So they didn't get those 13,000. They might have gotten 6,000 to 8,000 for that. And then there's also costs for kind of the interims things, etc. There's costs for taxes. There's corruption involved as well. So usually farmers get 60 to 70% of the forward sales of what the Ghanaian and Ivorians can do. At the moment, farmers are getting the highest price they have ever gotten in Cote d'Ivoire and in Ghana. And farmers are actually not per se very dissatisfied with this in Cote d'Ivoire. In Ghana, and again, this is a geeky podcast, so let's get a little bit geeky here. The price in dollars has gone up really, really a lot this year. But the price in the local currency, the cedi, has gone up virtually not at all because of massive inflation. So there's a real problem there as well, right? And some of these inflationary problems, in Ghana has a bigger problem than cocoa. Ghana is like on the constant verge of bankruptcy at the moment because of many governments in a row that have really done a poor job. So, there's the added thing that Ghana is the only country in West Africa with its own currency, and so it kind of is like a little ping pong ball on a big wave, and it goes all over the place. Most of West Africa has the franc CFA, which was granted originally quite a colonial thing as well, and the gold bullion that serves as the guarantor for the franc CFA is still held in Paris because the French don't trust the local governments to deal with their gold well. So there's and actually the franc CFA, the acronym used to stand for the colonies of France in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
CFA.
Right.
It now stands for Currency of Francophone Africa, but
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of like decolonization in that,
Yeah, deeply
right?
embedded.
Um,
Yeah.
but so are farmers getting a higher price? Not immediately. And definitely in Cote d'Ivoire and in Ghana, they weren't. Now they're getting a higher price, but there still are conversations like, okay, so can we modernize? Can we update? Can we improve this forward selling system so that we also get a better part of the upswing and we're not just protected against the downswing?
Mm.
Um, but the interesting thing is I've been talking to a lot of people in the private sector over the last year, and there's been this one complaint that a lot of these companies have been bringing to the table in like off the record conversations over a coffee table, right? They're like, oh, I was just in Brazil, and the farmers there, they're buying cars instead of investing in their farms. And I had the same complaint about Nigeria. I had the same complaint about Ecuador. I'm like, come on, guys. Is the underlying assumption that a farmer always has to be poor? And why should we always have to invest it back into his farm? Shouldn't farmers actually be allowed a certain modicum of relative income? I thought you believed in the free market. The market is good for the farmer. Shouldn't he be able to spend some of that money on themselves, right? So
Yeah. Reap the
there's
benefits,
there's
surely.
there's it's like we're free market until the market is actually good for farmers, and then all of a sudden we're like, no, like that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Um but the fact that farmers in lots of places in the world were able to buy cars this year is separate from the whole fossil fuel conundrum that brings up, which I think is a real conundrum.
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
Shows that it's not been a bad year for cocoa farming, probably across the world. This is the first time in my 2 decades in cocoa that probably at least half of the cocoa farmers are earning a living income. This also
Wow.
might be the last year in a while that
Mm. Yeah.
half the cocoa farmers are earning a living income, because this is not happening because we've done something right. This
Mm-hmm.
is happening because we've done something terribly wrong,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. It's not the
So
way that you wanted to achieve that, and it may scale
exactly. It
backwards.
was sheer accident that
Mm-hmm.
farmers are getting a good income this year.
Yeah. It's so interesting, really, really interesting. And, from all of those things that you described there, the with the price going up and things like this, I wanted to call out how some consumers may have seen this and trying to put two and two together. So I'm UK based. Within the UK, we have a well-loved chocolate bar called a Club,
Mhm.
with the slogan for many, many years. And the advert and the jingle is, if you like a lot of chocolate in your biscuit, join our club. That was the slogan that we have. A news report a couple of weeks ago that I read through and thought, I'm definitely going to bring this up with Anthony in our
Mhm.
conversation, was that the club maker is having to not call it a chocolate bar, because the level of cocoa and chocolate that's going into that bar going forward means that, I guess, there may be some regulations and the level of cocoa that you need in there. They are now going to have to call it a chocolate flavored
Yep.
bar, which
Mhm.
I just thought to myself, why is that? What has happened there? And I think a lot of the things that you touch on there, it must be to do with the cocoa price, the availability, things like this. Do you know of
Absolutely.
this story, and are you seeing this? What's been the reaction from a consumer point of view, and how do you see this going forward? Because I'd be interested to know how flavoring of chocolate
Mhm.
may be a competition for the chocolate industry as well.
Absolutely. So there's three major ways that the chocolate brands can respond to things like this at a consumer level, right? So if chocolate becomes 5 times as expensive.
Mm-hmm.
um, Even if chocolate it's not the whole set of ingredients, right? So it's not as if your bar has to become 5 times as expensive, but it's one of your
Mm-hmm.
major ingredients. It gets a lot more expensive. So what are you going to do with that incurred cost, right? By the way, it's not that farmers receive 5 times as much, right? That's
No,
definitely not
no.
happening, at least not in Cote d'Ivoire and in Ghana. And also in places like Nigeria and Cameroon, spot prices at the world market level raised higher than they got at farm gate, but they were still very happy with their farm gate level. But I digress. Back to the consumers. So, as a chocolate company, like when you make the final thing, there's a couple of things that you can do there, right? One thing that you can do there is change the cocoa content, right? So
Mm-hmm.
we'll just lower the cocoa content and we'll give them a milkier, sugarier version of it. Another thing that companies can do is add other ingredients to it. So infusions is what we call them. And so you'll see a lot of chocolate bars out there with extra nuts or with extra pieces of biscuits or with extra raisins or stuff like that, because all of this other stuff is like, or kind of, we've now new improved recipe with an internal cream block, right? And stuff like that, where they'll sell the bug as a feature, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's fine. This is what happens all the time. What they can also do is raise the price. Now, few people like raising the price, and so companies will
Yeah.
try to avoid that. But you'll have seen kind of prices raised as well. The other thing that you can sometimes see is they change the packaging sizes, and I think one of the most famous examples of that a couple of years ago, and also in the UK, was when Mondelez changed the shape of the Toblerone block and put more space between
Yes.
the
Yes.
triangles,
Big
and that
story.
turned into a massive PR nightmare because usually when they change the portioning, they do it in a subtle way, and this was as if they had the intern design the changed portions, because they like put the triangles twice as far apart, which is like, um if you're gonna steal from the cookie jar, then don't be so obvious about it, is
Yeah.
was the lesson there. But that's what you see as well, and we often call that shrinkflation. And so kind of you
Mm.
shrink the bar so that it's inflation. A long time ago, I used to smoke cigarettes as a bad habit, and I remember the day that the tobacco companies switched the content of the packaging from 20 to 19 cigarettes for the same price,
Mm-hmm.
which is a 5% profit margin increase for the
Yeah.
company, right? It's
Yeah.
things like that that you see happen a lot. And with prices going through the roof, I understand why companies have to look at ways to keep those costs manageable, because they are for-profit companies, right?
Yeah.
So, and
Yeah.
in the end, the thing is one of the reasons why this is happening is because farmers are so poor, because they are so unresilient, which means that as
Mm.
consumers, we've not been paying enough for our chocolate anyway for a very long time.
Yeah, absolutely. Really interesting. And I think, so many of those different options that you talk about and those different plays that companies will make. And, I understand why they want to avoid the price increases, because there's a
Hmm.
lot of challenges with that, with conversations with their own customers, the
Yep.
big retailers and the, department stores and things like this. There's challenges there. And, let's face it, consumers are very, very price conscious, especially at the moment with cost of living and things like these topics. So I think probably the first couple of options that you talked about there is probably going to be the most likely that companies are going to move to, based on these shocks that they see. Really, really
Absolutely.
fascinating. Anthony, uh, before we finish, I think it's been a fascinating conversation. I'm not going to say it's been a negative conversation, but I was about to say, let's talk some positives and let's think about all the challenges that are there.
Hmm.
Obviously, the great work that you do. And I think, we can touch on, and I'll put a link to the Cocoa Barometer, which I think everybody should have a read of, because it's really, really fascinating. Goes to that next level of geekiness that they want to, if they've following this conversation. But where do you see the positives, some best practice examples of where things are being done right in the cocoa industry?
Well, as you said in the introduction to this podcast, though the cocoa sector is doing poorly, we've seen a lot of change for the better over the past decades. I've been doing this for 20 years now almost. And um, I've seen everything change in cocoa, right? Like there's so much more collaboration, there's so much more availability and sharing of data, there's so much more acknowledgement of the problems, there's so much more of a
Mm.
holistic understanding of how deforestation and poverty and child labor and gender equality and transparency, how they all need to work together to get there, right? And I think that we've seen so many things change and improve over the past decades. And also over the last 6, 7 years, I've started to work a lot more in other commodities as well. And every time I kind of dip my toe in another pool, I'm always surprised of, oh, you're not doing that yet. Or, oh, interesting. You guys don't. Oh, all right. And so I do have the feeling that a lot of not on every topic, but on a lot of the metrics, cocoa is ahead of the curve in trying to understand and tackle problems. Now, having said all that, when I got into cocoa, it was because kids were doing work they weren't supposed to. And when I got into cocoa, farmers were dirt poor and women were not being treated equally and trees were being cut down. And those problems still remain very, very firmly at the center of the conversation, right? So I also want to avoid this sounding like a hallelujah story where we've solved it on to the next point.
Yeah.
I'd actually probably argue the exact opposite. I'd say, I think cocoa, because it's a global commodity, but also because it's still relatively concentrated, right? There's a couple of major countries. There's only a couple of major players. Like the cocoa sector is highly concentrated from a supply chain perspective. There's
Hmm.
maybe 7 or 8 big to medium-sized traders. There's 6 big chocolate brands. And so and there's maybe 8 major countries. I sometimes jokingly said, if I put the right 30 or 40 people in a room and they do what I tell them to do, we'll have solved the cocoa's problems overnight, right?
Yeah.
I'm also working extensively in the coffee sector. If we want that same level of impact, we'd need 500 people in a room and not 30 or 50,
Mm.
right? If you talk to palm oil, you're going to need even more people. If you took
Yeah.
textile and cotton, it becomes even more complex, right? So what I'm trying to say here is that, yes, we've come a long way. We still haven't solved the problems, but what I'm trying to say is that we need to really double down on these issues in cocoa to show that these problems can be solved. Because if we can't solve them in cocoa, I'm not sure we can solve them in coffee or cotton or soy or
Mm.
palm oil, right? Because those are more complex. Those are even more tricky to deal with. So, but we've made major steps in the ability to understand how child labor works in cocoa, for example. And so we've got much better data, much more acknowledgement of what's going on, at least in some of the key producer areas, not in all of them. We've even got a better idea of some of the things that do and don't work. Now, some companies need to get better at acknowledging that what they're doing doesn't work. I think that that's a real part of the problem. And I think we also really need to get the governments better on board, but we've seen major steps forward there. And if I compare that to my conversations in coffee, they don't understand their child labor problem at all, let alone understand how to start dealing with it, right?
Yeah. Mm.
Cotton has a major issue on this, and where's the outcry there? Where's the movement there? So on that level, we're ahead. If we look at the living income conversation, that there's this global living income community of practice where people from lots of different sectors, companies, NGOs, research institute, governments come together to discuss how do we solve the issue of smallholder poverty. Half of that conversation is about cocoa.
Mhm.
I mean,
Mhm.
if not more than half, right? And
Yeah.
so it's leading the way in several of these metrics, including on the need for regulation. Like the cocoa sector has been leading the charge in Brussels for many years now, saying to Brussels, look, we need these regulations. And when they
Mhm.
first started doing that, like politicians were like, excuse me, companies asking for regulation? We're used to you guys lobbying hard
Lobbying
against it,
away.
right? So, which also kind of is this purple cow idea that, hey, this is different. Let's have a look here.
Mm.
ironically enough, it was the company of the purple cow, Mondelez, that was leading that charge at the moment. They've really changed their game now. They're lobbying
Hmm.
against the regulations because they've actually got a completely untransparent supply chain, and they don't know where the cocoa is coming from, and they can't be transparent, which is their
Hmm.
problem because they've designed it that way. But interestingly enough, cocoa is leading the charge in asking for regulations and making those regulations as ambitious as possible as well. So, like I'd say, on living income, on child labor, on regulatory aspects, cocoa really has shifted the needle significantly over the past decade. So it is indeed not only a problem, a story of problems. And as we write in the barometer, we really have hope, not because we think that everything will turn out right, but because we see that when you try, you can actually make a massive difference.
Mm, absolutely. It's so interesting to understand, and great to hear as well. I mean, like you say, very pragmatically, all the issues that were there have not certainly by any means been solved, but there is hope there. There's been
Yep.
improvements. The future is perhaps looking brighter, and I really hope it does, because coming back to a consumer's perspective, do we want chocolate flavored products, or do we truly want the beauty that is chocolate? It is something that is synonymous with so many of us. Many occasions, a birthday, a Christmas, Diwali celebration, whatever else it may be, chocolate is going
Hmm.
to be there, and I think people will want that to continue. And these problems will need to be solved for that, for this supply chain to survive and continue and to thrive. I think that's the main thing as well.
Hmm. No, that's absolutely it. And I also think that if we want to have chocolate in the future, we're going to have to take good care of the planet now. A
Mm,
couple of years ago, you had these big climate marches all over the world, and I went there with
hmm.
my two eldest kids. And um, my son, I think he was 7 or 8 at the time, he decided to make this sign that said, "Save the planet. It's the only one with chocolate." And
Oh, I
and
love it.
that's like, if we want chocolate in the future, we better take care of this world right now and the people that are growing it, because
Yeah.
otherwise we're going to run out. So
Yeah, absolutely. Lovely. Yeah, so nice to hear, and I love that. Send us a picture of that banner if you've got it, because I think that would be absolutely
see if I
fantastic.
can find it. Yeah.
Amazing. I love that. I love that. Anthony, let's wrap up. It's been a fantastic conversation. Final question for people listening. If someone's listened to this, they've obviously had some interest, some fascination to really get underneath the cocoa supply chain and find out much more. What would you say to people if they want to do more, be more conscious consumer? What can they do around cocoa?
So there's two levels to answer that question. There, one as a consumer and the other as a citizen. Let's start with a consumer. When you walk into a store, it's hard to know what to buy, right?
Hmm.
It really is. Um, and I'd probably say look for the certification labels on it, because it shows that at least some effort has been put into it, because if people put effort into it, they want you to know that they've put effort into it, and so they'll tell you on the brand, right?
Hmm.
um but still, also in all those labels, whether those are like the fair trade or rainforest certificates, or there's a lot of private label certificates out
Yeah.
there as well. And
Yeah.
on those private labels, you also have to watch out a little bit that there's not a little bit of greenwashing or a lot of greenwashing going on there,
Hmm.
right? So um, there's only so much you can do as a consumer, right?
Hmm.
But kind of buy cocoa that is fair trade labeled or otherwise certified. I'd probably say, when you look at what's the best system out there that I know that helps farmers the best, it would be the Tony's open chain principle of Tony's
Hmm.
Chocolonely. That's not just in the Tony's Chocolonely chocolate. They actually sell that through quite a bunch of other organizations as well. But in the UK, I'm not quite sure exactly which brands those all are. I do know that Ben and Jerry's, for example, work
Yeah.
closely with them on that.
Hmm.
Um, but beyond being a consumer, we are first and foremost citizens. And so, like, we all go to the supermarket, but not everybody gets involved in asking their politicians or their companies to do it better. So, like if you would do a survey among your listeners of this podcast, and you're like, who of you has ever bought chocolate, you'll probably get close to 100% score.
Yeah.
If you would ask them, who of you has ever written or sent a message to a politician or a company about how they're sourcing stuff, that percentage goes down quite significantly. And so that doesn't mean that you need to give up your job and become an activist or stuff like that. But every company has a very simple contact form that you can get in touch with them and saying, we're concerned, we want you to do better. Every politician, definitely in the UK, because they want to be there for their local constituents, are reachable, right? So get in touch with them saying, hey, look, and in the UK, there's several regulations that are currently being discussed around forest protection, around due diligence, around modern slavery. Ask your politicians whatever side of the spectrum they're from. I believe that the Farage side of the spectrum might not be as receptive to this, but the rest will be. So I would say get in touch with your local representatives and ask them to be supportive of these sustainability regulations. And the funny thing is, because 100% of the people buy chocolate, but maybe 5 to 8% of people actually get in touch with their politicians or their companies, all of a sudden you're increasing your impact by at least 10 to 15 fold, not percent.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So become a citizen, not just a consumer, would probably be the short answer to that question.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's a fantastic thing for people to take away and really start to ponder and think about. And I hope there are flurries of emails and letters going to politicians and to companies from listeners, because the first stage, I think, is listening to a conversation like this, just becoming more aware of the supply chains and the industries behind the materials that touch our lives, but then it's information moving to action. So I think that's a great way to finish. Antonie, this has been a fantastic conversation. I have learned so much. I hope everyone else has that is going to be listening to this. So I thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Amazing. And I look forward to keeping an eye on the cocoa sector and seeing all the fantastic work and that hope that you gave there for a bright and resilient future.
Good stuff, Ben. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Speak again soon.